So, one of the really interesting things about Donald Trump's predicament right now, unlike most criminal defendants, if Donald Trump's first criminal trial, his first criminal prosecution set for March 4th slips, if that trial date gets continued because it gets hung up in appellate courts, he's got a backup auxiliary criminal trial set for March 25th up in New York. That was really his first go around at trying to gain unfair advantage in a presidential election through the hush money scheme. And in the unlikely event the March 25th trial date doesn't hold, he has yet another backup auxiliary criminal trial set for May 20th. So Donald Trump will be going to trial. He will be prosecuted. And I maintain, Steph, once these cases move into a court of law and move away from the court of public opinion, and things like the rules of evidence are applied to what the jury gets to hear and what the jury doesn't get to hear, these are going to be strong cases on the evidence.
When and if they happen, the name of the game is delay for Donald Trump, and there could be delays. Garrett, Donald Trump is now using the messaging he's using in the courtrooms on the campaign trail. You heard him right there saying Joe Biden isn't beating me in the polls, so he's using the courts to get me. Is he getting any traction beyond his base that he doesn't lose no matter what?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's locking up more and more of the Republican primary electorate beyond just the typical Republican base. I mean, what you're seeing now is a small minority of the electorate who kind of sit in that never Trump or post-Trump camp. But Trump's been dominating in the early state polls and even more so in the national polls, where voters are a little bit less engaged with this process than they are in those first four primary states. And this really started back in New York with the hush money case that Glenn Kirshner was just talking about. The idea that that case almost inoculated Trump with Republican voters who didn't feel like that case was particularly strong. And that's when Trump started making the argument that these cases are about weakening him politically, not holding him accountable legally. That's an argument that has only grown in the minds of a lot of Republican voters, and it's made him stronger in the polls, and it's had the follow-on effect of a lot of his Republican rivals feeling as though they have to defend him against Joe Biden and a weaponized GOJ. I put that in air quotes because there's no evidence of it in any kind of real sense, but it has become a political narrative that Republicans, even those who would like to beat Trump, can't get away from. And all of that has just made him stronger and stronger as we approach these early contests. It's just stunning, that same weaponized DOJ that's charging Joe Biden's son. I don't know how both those things can be true. Glenn, though, let's talk about this main ballot appeal. I want to share what we heard earlier from Andrew Weissmann about it.
She followed the Maine law to the letter. It's wrong to characterize this as, oh, the Secretary of State is the only person who is unilaterally making a decision. That's not the final word.
Donald Trump also accused her of bias in taking him off the ballot. What do you make of this argument, or what do you make, Glenn, of what Trump is trying to say?
Donald Trump can only fight these cases in the court of public opinion because these election officials, secretaries of state, Colorado courts, including, how about the Michigan court, and it looks like California, where they're making the opposite decision, where Donald Trump is not disqualified and his name can go on the ballot. These people, these election officials, these judges are following the law. They're following their oath of office, their sworn duty. That is why the Maryland Secretary of State, Secretary Bellows, did what she did. She held a hearing. The evidence showed, not surprisingly, that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. Therefore, she was duty-bound to disqualify him, just as if he were 34 years old or he was not a natural-born citizen. And now it will move into the courts. Why? Because the Maine law provides for a court challenge. The cases are playing out, the decisions are playing out the way they are supposed to play out. However, every time one goes against Donald Trump, it's because he's got all these perceived enemies who are out to get him. No, these are just government officials doing their job.
All right, Katie, here's my head scratcher, though. The original Maine decision cited part of the 14th Amendment barring anyone involved in an insurrection while an officer of the United States. Donald Trump's appeal is saying that it doesn't apply to him because he never served as an officer of the United States or took an oath to support the Constitution. On what planet can he argue that? Isn't that obviously what a president of the United States does?
So I think that what he's referencing is the fact that the president is one of the offices that's not explicitly named in the statute. However, to your point, it's really hard to argue that being the president of the United States is not the same as being an officer. So it's almost as though he's looking at a point of omission and trying to build a case around that. I mean, it's not the first time we've seen him do this in court filings, but it does seem to be, to your point, one of the more egregious instances.
Garrett, you were at the Capitol on January 6th. And lots of people say it was a crazy day, it was a terrible day, but it was a one-off and it can't possibly happen again. But here we are. The Secretary of State in Maine is getting threats. Her family is getting threats. Her office is getting threats. Is D.C. aware? What does the Capitol, what do people in D.C. think about the pressure, the stress on our system right now?
Well, look, in terms of another January 6th, I think part of the problem there was a failure of imagination. The idea that something that big could even happen at the U.S. Capitol or in Washington, D.C. at all was out of the realm of possibility. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think federal officials, local officials in D.C. are certainly aware of the anger that's out there in the country and the ability that Donald Trump has to control and sometimes weaponize that anger to great effect for his ends. But I don't think we're going to see another January 6th. I do think this kind of more targeted violence and intimidation campaigns have been built into our politics, not since January 6th, but even preceding that, and it's just going to become more common. Most members of Congress you talk to have spent way more money in recent years on their own personal security. They've basically all dealt with threats. Many have been swatted. This is becoming something that's built into our political system. The threat, the specter of violence is now one of the things you have to deal with if you sign up to do the job. It's a cancer on our politics, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon.
My God. All right, Glenn, let's talk about Trump's trials. We are now weeks away. You just brought it up, but we're now weeks away from the first votes in 2024, and Trump has a long legal road ahead. If you're Trump's legal team, how anxious are you about what could potentially come out in these cases? Because none of it has come out yet. Most people have never even heard Jack Smith speak. And Trump is on the podium day in and day out or on social media making his case, whether it's true or not.
You know, whatever comes out in courts of law, once these cases are being argued to a jury, really won't matter in the court of public opinion. I think they will matter in the courtrooms. And as I say, I think the evidence ultimately on the merits will be pretty overwhelming, pretty compelling. But regardless of the political consequences of how these trials fall, let me tell you, Steph, this old prosecutor never made prosecutorial decisions based on collateral consequences. Every time I hear people complain or observe that, oh, another prosecution against Donald Trump only makes him stronger among his supporters and his base, as a prosecutor, I would say, I don't care. I don't care if it means the nomination is a lock. We don't make prosecutorial decisions based on collateral consequences. We make prosecutorial decisions because somebody, in fact, in this instance, the highest office holder in the United States, committed crimes, democracy-busting crimes. The law supports prosecuting him for those crimes. Collateral consequences be damned. This has to be done.
Katie, Bill Barr, Trump's former attorney general, has made it clear he is done with Trump. But he thinks booting Trump off of ballots is not a good idea and it's destructive. Does this open the door that future politicians in future elections could look for technicalities? And I'm not in any way implying that the president or anyone in the Democratic Party is doing that. But could this open the door that in the future politicians could look for technicalities to get their opponents booted off ballots?
I mean, I think that because of what's already happened, we'll see that occur no matter what, because politics has become such a there's just so much retribution in politics right now. But I think that one of the things that Barr says that is interesting is that, he and others have said that what we need voters to repudiate Donald Trump, to say that this is not who we want as president of the United States. There is a practical matter about having Trump taken off some ballots in some states and not others. I mean, it is a patchwork of laws. Each state looks at this a little bit differently. We do need some consistency, which is why so many people are really sure that the Supreme Court is going to weigh in and make a final verdict, simply because we do need all 50 states to come to an agreement, not just on whether or not Donald Trump should be on the ballot, but even something like, and who knows whether the Supreme Court will address this or not, but even something like whether or not Donald Trump, his actions rose to the level of insurrection as defined in the 14th Amendment. Keep in mind, the 14th Amendment itself is very vague. It says things like insurrection. It doesn't define it, nor does it say who should define it. So right now we have 50 bodies defining it in 50 different ways, and that can't really stand either. So there are reasons why I think that the Supreme Court is expected to make some sort of ruling on this at the end of the day.